Hi, I'm Christy and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm here with some historical fiction book recs. So historical fiction is one of my favorite subgenres to read, and I've read a ton in the past year, so I wanted to do an updated video because I had a historical fiction book rec video last year, and I wanted to do one again freshly this year because I have read a lot in the past year. So if you do want to see that recommendation video as well that I just talked about, I'll link it in the description below. I also have a playlist there as well if you want more historical fiction content from me of book recommendations, historical fiction favorites, historical fiction book shopping. I have 2025 new releases for historical fiction, all the things. So if you want even more historical fiction content, it is all below for you as well. Like I said, this is a new video today, so I'm not going to talk about any of the books that I already recommended in that first video last year. I'm going to do new, fresh ones for you. So again, if you want even more historical fiction content, all the links are below for you. So I believe I have about 25 historical fiction books to recommend today, and I'm so excited to get into these. Like I said, it's one of my favorite subgenres to read. I'm always looking for new historical fiction recs, so definitely drop some in the comments below if there's any that you have loved recently. I'm a co-host for a historical fiction book club as well, which is Leave It to the Pros. All the links for that, we have an Instagram where we share all of our monthly picks. That's all in the description as well as I'm going to link every book that I talk about. So if you miss any of these, missed any of the titles, the author names, they will all be linked below for you. So I think that is all the things that are linked below. If you can't tell, all the info you're going to need is below. So with all that out of the way, let's get into these books. Alright, so first up is The Porcelain Maker by Sarah Freethy. This is a debut historical fiction release from this author. I really enjoyed this one. This one takes place during World War II, and it is dual timeline, so it also goes into, I think, the 1990s is the time frame that we catch up to one of the characters in. So this one, the book starts off in the 90s, and we're following this character who is trying to search down these porcelain items that were made at a Dachau concentration camp factory during World War II. So she's trying to track down these items because supposedly that's the only link she has to her birth father. And so that is what she's doing in the 90s. And then we go back in time to, I want to say 1929, 1930. And we meet these two college students in Germany. One of them is a Jewish architect. And the other one, I believe she's German and she is an avant-garde painter. And so in here, we kind of see their romance flourishing and how they're both very much into the art scene. And then we, of course, get into World War II and kind of see where this couple goes from there. In this book, it definitely features on kind of the art scene as well and what was thought of that at the time. So yeah, really enjoyed this one, a debut by this author, and I can't wait to check out more from her in the future. Next up is The Lies We Leave Behind by Noelle Salazar. So this is my favorite book that I've read from this author so far. This one is her newest release. It just came out in the fall of 2024. This one, I will say, it has a slower start, but once the story kicks up, it definitely grabs your attention. This one is World War II, and we're following a flight nurse who is kind of somewhere out in the Pacific working. So we kind of see her everyday life, and then some things happen where she gets injured, she has some secrets, she has to go home to recover, and some other things kind of spiral from there. This one I really, really loved. Like I said, the first half was a little bit slow, but once it got going, it really, really grabs your attention. There's a bit of a kind of mystery to this one, and this one is told in dual timeline as well, where we're following a character in present day and kind of seeing how his story connects to some of the characters during this time of the book. This one left me kind of emotional towards the end as well, which if you read it, you'll see what I mean. Highly recommend. Really enjoyed Noelle Salazar, and this is her newest release that I really loved. Next is Take My Hand by Dolene Perkins Valdez. This one I have talked about endlessly. It was one of my favorite books of 2024. This one takes place in the US during the 1970s. I want to say 1973. Yes, in Montgomery, Alabama. So in this one, it is post-segregation Alabama. We're following a Black nurse, and it is her first job at a family planning clinic. And so we see in here how she ends up getting her first two patients, and they are very young girls. I want to say they're 11 and 13 possibly, and she's kind of tasked with giving them birth control. And so at first she kind of just goes along with it, and then you see her over time starting to question things, question her workplace environment, question why she's doing this to these girls, and then it just kind of goes from there. This one is based on a true story of a nurse who was a whistleblower on this huge case that happened in the US in the 70s. Really enjoyed this one. Just know it is a very heavy content warning in here. This one, the author's writing immediately grabbed my attention. She is automatically a new auto-buy author for me. Love her writing so much. This book was just so good, heavy hitting, but definitely recommend. Next up is The House on Biscayne Bay by Chanel Cleeton. So Chanel Cleeton is a historical fiction author that I finally got to in 2024, and I love her books so much. This one is a standalone, and it's kind of more historical fiction mystery. So if you love a good murder mystery, kind of like a Clue type of house setting, this book is definitely that. This book centers around this Gothic mansion in Miami that we see is being built. So basically this one takes place right after World War I, where a bunch of Americans were flocking to South Florida to kind of make a fortune. So in here we see this wealthy industrialist and his wife, and he wants to build this gorgeous Gothic mansion, which of course is the house on Biscayne Bay. So we see that house being built, and during its grand opening, there is a murder mystery that happens. And then we cut to quite a few years later, and there are some new people living in the house, and another murder mystery happens. And it kind of goes from there, and we get to see how the house is a part of the story, how the characters connect, and just all of the things. I really enjoyed this one, especially if you want like more of that kind of Gothic, where the house is a part of the story as well, and just that kind of like atmospheric, lush mystery setting. This one is definitely that. Speaking of Chanel Cleeton, like I said, I love all of her books so much. I have a whole author guide to her books on my channel, which I'll link below as well. So this series minus one book that my parents are currently borrowing. This is the Perez family series, and I love the series to pieces. There are 5 books in the series. The series is complete. The first book in the series is Next Year in Havana, and I highly recommend. Her books are always told in dual timeline, and we get to see some Cuban history and kind of families and secrets. She always has a little bit of a romance in her stories as well, and I just highly recommend. They're very fast-paced and just so stinking good. So in Next Year in Havana, it is present day, and we're following this granddaughter who grew up with her grandmother in Miami, and her grandmother always talked about how amazing living in Cuba growing up was, and just kind of her memories from that place. And her grandmother has recently passed away, so the heroine decides, you know what, I am a travel journalist, I'm gonna go there and kind of see all these places my grandmother always talked about. So she ends up going there, and along the way you see her story taking place in current day Cuba. Then we go back to the 1950s, which is her grandmother's story, and her grandmother is one of the Perez sisters who was kind of raised sheltered and wasn't really familiar or knowing what was going on with the political kind of struggles and times of Cuba during the 1950s. And so she was the daughter of a sugar baron, and her family ended up fleeing Cuba to go to the US. And so you kind of see her story unfolding in a little bit of a forbidden romance that she had as well during those times. So the next one in the series is When We Left Cuba. This is one of my favorites in the series. So this one takes place during the 1960s, and in here we're following one of the Perez sisters, and she ends up getting hired on by the CIA to infiltrate Fidel Castro's kind of inner circle, and it kind of goes from there. So we get a lot of the Cuban American politics of the 60s. We see JFK, John F. Kennedy, becoming president, and everything that happens there, the Bay of Pigs, kind of all of these things coming to be. I love this one. Her job as a spy was just so interesting, so highly recommend this one as well. The next one in the series is The Last Train to Key West, and this is my favorite in the series. I love this one to pieces. So this one takes us back to the 1930s, and it follows the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 that happened in Florida. During the times, this was the strongest and deadliest in recorded history that hit US soil. This one, it was a Category 5 before they even had category ratings for hurricanes, and we get to see it kind of play out while we follow 3 different heroines who are all in Key West in Florida at the same time. This one is so good, very emotional. I just love the way that Chanel Cleeton writes her characters, how they all connect, how the stories and the histories and just like everything happening, it just ties together so beautifully. Highly recommend this one. The next one in the series is The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. There are a couple of these that you'll want to read kind of in order, but some of these, especially the last 2, you could read in any particular order because they're set during different times. So this one takes place during the Gilded Age, which is basically 1890s, kind of turn of the century, and we start off in New York. And so we are following some newspaper tycoons of the time, which is William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and kind of seeing their feud during the time. And in here we're following 3 different heroines. So one of them is a kind of reporter journalist who is working there, and then it's kind of about a true story that they were featuring at the time, which is this young girl who was wrongly imprisoned in Cuba. And so it kind of goes from there with her storyline, as well as a woman in Cuba who is trying to kind of help get this woman free. And we kind of see how the times, the story kind of propels the US into a war with Spain, and it goes from there. So then the last one in the series is Our Last Days in Barcelona. So this one kind of ties the whole series back up together. Basically in here, this is the book for the 3rd sister of the Perez family, and in here we also get her mother's story as well. So this one takes place in the 1960s in Spain, and we see the sister of this one, she's going to try to find this sister who was the spy in this book. She wants to go find her because the last place she was seen was in Spain. So she gets to her house and her sister's not there, but there's this man also looking for her sister, and so they kind of team up and decide to work together. During the same time, she ends up finding out that her mother during the 1930s went to Barcelona as well. She kind of never knew that this had happened, and it's kind of a little bit of a family secret, and it goes from there. Like I said, I just love this series overall, the way that the families connect. There's always like secrets and romances and just all the things, but the history as well is just so good. In this one, we see some violence brewing in Spain and kind of the start or on the brink of a civil war happening in Spain. Kind of goes from there. Highly recommend this entire series so much. much. Next up is The Briar Club by Kate Quinn. This is this author's newest release that just came out in the summer of 2024. So this one takes place during the 1950s in the US, and it's during the McCarthy era. And so a lot of paranoia and secrets and kind of all of those things. And here we're following a boarding house where a bunch of women live, and we get to see how they form this Briar Club, kind of like this supper club where they get together and meet. So we see a lot of their kind of interpersonal relationships, and we get to see kind of some of all of the heroines' stories as well. I really love this one because we get a full cast of characters, and you really get to know kind of all of these different people's stories. And here we get a murder mystery as well, and so I just loved the mystery elements to the story. So yeah, highly recommend this one. This is The Briar Club by Kate Quinn. This is my favorite that I've read from this author so far. Next up is Last Christmas in Paris, and this is a collab with Hazel Gaynor and Heather Webb. This is one of my favorite books of 2024. I love this book to pieces. It is just so good, so emotional. I cried multiple times reading this book. So this is a World War I historical fiction, and this is an epistolary story. So basically the entire book is told through letters, through newspaper articles, through telegrams, where the different characters kind of communicate. And so I love that about this book, which I will show. So as you can see, there are kind of different letters between the characters. We get some telegrams happening as well. So basically in here, we're following these four main characters, and they're kind of all connected. So one of them, we'll just say she's the main heroine. And so we're seeing World War I happening with England getting involved, and kind of the country, the world at the time, they didn't think it was going to be that big of a thing. They thought they would be back before Christmas, like it would just be over and done with. But of course that wasn't the case. The war went on for years. And so we kind of see that naivete they had towards the war and kind of things changing as it went on. So that main character, we're following her, and then we see her brother who ends up going off to war. We see her brother's best friend who also goes to war, and then we see the heroine's best friend who ends up becoming a nurse during the time as well. This one, like I said, you get to follow all of their stories and kind of see how they connect and the different things they're going through over time. This deals with the trauma and kind of PTSD and things that weren't diagnosed at the time or labeled, and kind of all the struggles that is just happening during World War I. And it kind of just goes from there. So this covers, I think, 4 years, 1914 through 1918, and then it is in dual timelines, so we catch up to present day as well. I was just obsessed with this book. Love the characters so much, and just like how emotionally gripping the story is. Just highly recommend. This is a World War I historical fiction. If you do the audiobook, it has a full cast narration, so each character gets a different narrator for their voice. I just love this one to pieces. Highly recommend. Next up is The Women from Kristen Hanna. This is another 2024 favorite of mine. So Kristen Hanna is a huge historical fiction author. I have read and loved a majority of her books, so I did talk about some of her books in my previous video, but during that time The Women was not out yet, so now I can talk about it here. This book, I know that so many people have probably already read this book. It was such a huge book of 2024, but if you haven't and you need that little extra push to get you to read this book, highly recommend you do so. So in this one we follow a few different women who are part of the Vietnam War and kind of over there as nurses, and we follow one in particular who ends up joining up because her brother is in the army, and she decides she wants to help out as well. And this is another one where the newspapers and the US and the government at the time downplayed how actually brutal the war was and how bad things were over there. So the heroine joins up, and as soon as she gets over there, she realizes that she has no idea what she's doing, what's going on, and it kind of goes from there. Most of the book, though, it actually doesn't take place during the war. It is kind of after the fact. So the heroine ends up coming back home, and you see all of the struggles, just the mental, the physical struggles that she's having, as well as with family and friends and the government and hospitals. Like, none of them can understand or even try to understand all that trauma she went through, and just kind of that post-war support. Like, they're like, oh, there were no women over there during Vietnam War. Like, what are you talking about? There were actually soldiers out there who were fighting. Like, you don't count. So it kind of goes from there, and it's just such a strong, powerful book. The writing, fantastic. The audiobook for this one, highly recommend. I know it won like a ton of like audio awards last year as well. So good. Kristen Hanna just always hits for me. Next up is All We Were Promised by Ashton Lattimore. I believe this is a debut from this author, and this is another author I want to keep my eye on because I really enjoyed her writing. And this one takes place during pre-Civil War in Philadelphia. So this is like 1830s, early 1840s in Philadelphia. And in this story, we're following 3 different women mainly, but basically this book kind of shines a light on all the Black men and women who were part of the shaping of Philadelphia, the abolitionist movement during that pre-Civil War in US history. So this one we see 3 different women. We follow their stories. stories and kind of how they all are working together, but they also come from very different backgrounds, very different stories. So I really enjoyed the history elements of this one. So if you want a pre-Civil War Philadelphia in the US, this one, definitely check it out. Like I said, I want to keep an eye out for new releases from this author as well now. Next is Homegoing by Ya Jessie. So this is one that I read last year and absolutely loved. This is a kind of, it spans centuries, many different generations of one family. This is another one I'll have to put the cover up here because my parents are borrowing it right now. So this one takes place during the, or it starts off in the 1700s in Ghana. So we're following two half-sisters and we see how their lives take different routes and kind of it goes from there. So each sister gets a chapter and this is very much like a family history story. So like I said, it spans generations, and in here we get a chapter from each character. So the two sisters, they each get a chapter at the beginning of the book, and then from there we get a descendant of theirs, they get a chapter, and then their descendants, and down the line all the way up into present day. So like I said, it spans like 300 years of this family's history. I love in here how all of the stories kind of connect, and they're all in different places at different times, but you really see how this huge like just family tapestry kind of comes into play, and you see the strength and resilience of these characters. And I just loved the way that the story was told. It's basically like a family tree, but in literary form, and I just really appreciated it, really enjoyed all the stories. They're basically like short stories, a collection of short stories, but they all connect. And so they were just so good. Highly recommend Homegoing. This one was fantastic on audio. Next up is The Lotus Shoes by Jan Yang. So this is a new 2025 historical fiction release, and this one takes place during the 1800s in China. And so in here we are following two different women who kind of meet as children, where they're very much from different lives. Basically in here, one of the girls, her family is wealthy and kind of nobility, or so to speak at the time, and her family ends up purchasing the other girl to kind of be their daughter's companion, maid, eventually as she grows up, like her chaperone, kind of a built-in friend, I guess you could say, some of the time. So it kind of goes from there, and like I said, it is the 1800s in China. So you kind of see how older traditions are still in effect, but also they are kind of getting opened up to the Western world and kind of some new customs, new things that some families want to incorporate into their lives. And in here you follow those two girls over time, and you kind of see their relationship over the years. Sometimes they're friendly, most of the time it's not. There's a lot of like jealousy and competitiveness and just kind of those complicated feelings between these two women over their lives. I really appreciated this one. The two characters were just so interesting to follow. So yeah, highly recommend The Lotus Shoes by Jan Yang. Next is Last Twilight in Paris by Pam Jenoff. This is another 2025 historical fiction release. This one takes place during World War II, and it kind of has dual timeline where it is during the war as well as after the war in the 50s. So in here we start off in the 50s, and there's this woman and she kind of finds this old locket in London, and so she's like, oh my god, I remember this locket from my time helping out during the war in France. And so she decides to kind of go track down and get into the history of this necklace. And so it kind of goes from there, and you see back during the flashbacks back to 1940s during France, we're following a Jewish woman, and we kind of see her life, her marriage, her relationship, and of course seeing France get occupied by Germany during World War II. This woman eventually ends up getting imprisoned with other Jewish people during the time, and they are basically put into this kind of like workforce where they have to work at this old like fancy department store in France, and they're basically going through other Jewish people's belongings and selling them to German soldiers and stuff during the time. So it kind of goes from there. This is based on like a true little bit of history during World War II, and you see how this necklace kind of connects these two characters, and it goes from there. Next is Miss Morgan's Book Brigade by Janet Skesling Charles, and so this one was a World War I historical fiction. This one I really enjoyed as well. This is the newest release from this author. So in this one we're following Anne Morgan, who is the daughter of JP Morgan. So she's the heiress of this entire US banking fortune, and you see in here how she uses her funds to kind of help rebuild different parts of France who were kind of at the front line during the war. So she ends up kind of acquiring, hiring on, paying for a bunch of New York public librarians to travel over to France and be a part of kind of her team where they're trying to rebuild France and especially help with kind of the library system over there. So you're following a character who is a librarian at the New York Public Library, and she goes over there and you get to see her helping the first kind of female librarians of France kind of come up to be. You see them building a children's library, which I guess France had never had at the time. You see them also making these bookmobiles where basically they take ambulances and different other vehicles that were used during the war that are no longer in service, no longer being used, and they end up taking those and transforming them into these kind of bookmobiles, like library's books on wheels. So I thought all of those parts were really interesting. I love like the library, the book aspect of it all. This one is in dual timeline as well. So you get to follow another New York public librarian in the 1980s, where she basically hears the story of the woman that you're following in the story. And she's like, what happened to her? Like she just kind of disappeared off of the pages and nobody knows what happened to her. Like I want to know more about her story. And so it goes from there. Next is Isela by Allegra Goodman. This is another 2025 historical fiction release. And this one I loved so much. Another one that's based off of a true person in history. So this one kind of kicks off in France in the 1500s. So I want to say like 1530s, 1540s, 1550s. And so in here we're following this young girl who is an heiress at the time. So you see that she's born into nobility, but of course she doesn't realize it. She's a child. When she's born, her mother dies during childbirth. Her father dies when she's a young girl as well, fighting for the king. And so you see that she ends up getting this guardian who kind of takes over her life, her house, her finances. She's just a young girl, so she doesn't realize that she has a chateau. She has all this money, and so he kind of ends up taking her money and using it to spend and do whatever he wants to do with it. He kind of sees himself as a explorer and kind of pays for a lot of his expedition funds. And so you see as this girl grows up, she becomes a teenager and he decides to take her on one of his expeditions where he's going to travel from France over to New France, which is Canada of present day time. And so he takes her on his ship with him, and you see her connect with this servant boy who is on the ship as well. And so her guardian finds out, is so pissed at both of them, and he ends up isolating them, leaving them behind on this Arctic island out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So the book kind of kicks off from there, and you see this survival and just the strength of women. Like I said, it's based off of a true person in history, which is wild to me. So anyways, it just goes from there. The writing in here was amazing. I loved how just like lush the prose was. Highly recommend. It just kind of read like this very like epic poem story, which I mean it kind of is, of this person's life. Highly recommend checking it out. Next up is Sisters in Arms by Kaya Alderson. So this is another one where I believe it's the author's debut, so I definitely want to check out more from them in the future. And this one takes place during World War II, where it's following the only all-black battalion of Army Corps women who were kind of hired on to go through the mail for servicemen and women who were fighting during World War II. And there was like, I think, multiple years of backlog of mail to go through, and so it kind of follows their story. And in here you really get kind of less of the wartime, but you really get to know two of these characters in particular and kind of their lives building up to joining, their time during boot camp, and you get to see like racial prejudices and things like that kind of take place throughout their lives. And it kind of goes from there. This was one where, again, I want to check out more from this author in the future because I really enjoyed the writing. Next is The Frozen River, and this one is one where it takes place, I want to say the 1789 in Maine. So this one is another one where it's kind of based on a true person in history. So in here we're following this woman who was a kind of renowned 18th century midwife during the US, and she had like extensive journals and diaries of kind of all of her patients and cases and things happening in this small town in Maine. And so in here there was a bit of a murder mystery element to it, and a lot of like heavy content warnings in here for just some of the things that this woman sees, knows about, deals with. And so it kind of goes from there, where you see how her journals and the woman herself is brought into this murder mystery case, and it kind of goes from there. This one's kind of a slow build, but this one I feel like if you enjoy those ones that have that kind of that medical element to them, and again another one where it's like the strength of women, this book is definitely that. Next up is Signal Moon by Kate Quinn. So this is a historical fiction novella. It's on KU with the read and listen feature. So if you grab the ebook off of Kindle Unlimited, you get the audiobook with it for as long as you have the book checked out from KU. This one, like I said, very short novella. It's World War II, and I really enjoyed this one. I feel like if you go in not knowing too much, you will definitely just be along for the ride. So this one, like I said, it's World War II, and we see a woman who is kind of a socialite pre-war, and you see her having to kind of get a job. So she ends up kind of getting a job to work with Bletchley Park. So basically she is in charge of, she wears headphones, and she kind of has to intercept these naval communications and send the messages along to Bletchley Park for them to kind of decode or translate or whatever the case. So one night she's listening in to kind of signals and calls, and she ends up getting this SOS call from somebody in the US Navy. And so she's trying to help and figure out why nobody else is kind of hearing this or trying to talk about it or help this guy. So she ends up overhearing his call, and it kind of goes from there, where she's trying to figure out where he's at, when he's at, all of these things. Like I said, it's a novella. Highly recommend. This is on Kindle Unlimited. I have a whole Kindle Unlimited historical fiction Rex as well video, which I'll link in the description of the video as well if you want to go check out more that you can get on KU. Next is Harlem Rhapsody by Victoria Christopher Murray. So this one is so good. I recently read it for a book club, and this one is a new 2025 book release as well. This one takes place during the Harlem Renaissance, so like the 1919s, 1920s. Here we're following the first literary editor of the Crisis magazine and her journey of working with W.E.B. Du Bois boys during the time who started the Crisis magazine and was one of the founders of the NAACP. You see her kind of interpersonal relationship with him, work relationship over the years. You see her kind of dreams of being a writer and an editor herself. Again, another one that's based off of true people in history. So you see her life and very much how work is so important to her. I loved seeing how she was just trying to uplift and find Black voices and artists of the time and give them a place to write. She ended up being the first one who found or was the first editor for Langston Hughes and Connie Colin and just a bunch of different writers and poets and artists during the Harlem Renaissance. So highly recommend this one. The audiobook was really great. Another one during the Harlem Renaissance is A Love Song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams. So this one is kind of told during dual timeline. So you get present day as well as you flash back to the Harlem Renaissance as well. And this one is a bit of like historical fiction with magical realism. So just know that going in, this one is very much more of a romance where there is very much these fated souls and you kind of see how they come together. So I did really enjoy this one. Just know it has that kind of magical realism element to it as well. All right, and then the last one I have to recommend is The Book Club for Troublesome Women by Marie Bostwick. This one I had an early copy of it, so it's not out yet. I believe it comes out in April of 2025. This one I really enjoyed. I loved these women's stories. This takes place during the 1960s in the US, and this one is very much kind of following these suburban women who are kind of housewives and they've kind of forgotten about what they wanted to do with their lives, whether that was career aspirations or their own goals, kind of all of those things. And so The Feminine Mystique is a book that ends up coming out and kind of setting the world aflame, and it kind of sets these women's lives onto new paths as well. And you see them form a book club, and then they just kind of get to know one another and get to know one another's lives, and you see them kind of discover what they want to do. And it kind of gives them the ability to be able to say, yeah, like, what do I want with my life? Do I want to be like a housewife and a mom? Do I want more? Like, do I want more out of my relationships with my husband, with whoever, with my children, my mother? So it kind of goes from there. I really enjoyed all of these characters and how they connected. Just such a good one. All right, and then the last one that I actually forgot to mention earlier when I was doing Chanel Cleeton books. So this is The Cuban Heiress. So this one takes place during the 1930s in the US, and it's basically on this luxury cruise, which was a big thing during the Prohibition era when you couldn't drink on US soil. So people would get on these luxury cruises and kind of drink all the way down to Cuba, come back and drink all the way back, and then it kind of didn't count, I guess, since it wasn't on US soil. So we're following two different women on the ship at the same time, and we see in here how the one who was kind of dubbed the Cuban heiress, she is with her new fiance, and you kind of see that relationship play out, as well as the way that the other woman kind of connects to their story as well. And so it kind of goes from there. This one very much is kind of more of that mystery spy trying to kind of team up together and figure things out, and it goes from there. So yeah, that is The Cuban Heiress. All right, so those are all my recent historical fiction recommendations. Definitely let me know in the comments if you've read any of these. If you have any historical fiction recommendations from me, I would love to know. Like I said, I have linked below all the books and the titles that I talked about, as well as my historical fiction playlist, where I talked about has even more historical recommendations, as well as the first video I did last year that has even more recs as well. So if you want to get to any of those, definitely check out the description of the video. And if you'd rather leave me an emoji in the comments today to let me know that you watched this video, leave me the lifesaver floaty, the kind of red and white float, since the Cuban Heiress had it on its cover. I'll put it up here as well, so you know what I'm talking about. So definitely leave that in the comments. And if you haven't done so yet, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my future historical fiction content. And I will see you in my next one. Bye!